He pushed him away, right there in the corporate parking lot, under the harsh white of LED lamps and the distracted hum of late commuters. And for a second, the whole world narrowed to a small handful of hands, a paper-wrapped pastry tumbling to the asphalt, and the slow, impossible silence that followed a wrong move. Michael Grayson did not mean to be cruel. He meant to be efficient. He meant to protect the image he had worked a lifetime to build, a tidy suit, a polished car, a schedule where feelings were an inconvenient interruption. But the homeless boy had come too close, with a shy, earnest grin and a request that landed like a pebble in a pond full of glass. May I dance with your daughter?" he asked, voice small but steady. They were in the back row of the company donors' luncheon crowd, near the catering trucks and the trash bins, where the smell of fried pastry and coffee met the cold of the evening air. The paper sack that held Livy's snack, warm, greasy, with the kind of comfort food that makes even carefully reheated hospital meals seem like ceremonies, rustled in Michael's hand. The boy's fingers hovered over the sack, not to seize, but to offer. He had nothing much to give except a smile and the kind of attention Lily had not seen in a long time. Something in Michael snapped. Maybe it was the thought of headlines, of whispers, an executive letting a homeless person anywhere near his family. Maybe it was the muscle memory of a life taught to prefabricate boundaries, the sort you buy with money and schedule with calendar alerts. He shoved the boy's shoulder lightly, a motion meant to be more push than shove, and the boy stumbled back, the paper sack spilling a warm, greasy lump of pastry onto the gravel. The sound of it hitting the pavement was somehow obscene. Around them, bodies tightened. A woman from Human Resources gasped. A man with a glossy tie, a board member, frowned and looked for an exit strategy. Lily, strapped lightly into her wheelchair, turned her face toward the commotion and watched with slow, bright interest. She had been watching everything lately. She had an attention that felt like a lamp switched on after a long winter. When the boy's eyes met hers, he did not flinch. He swept his hand toward the fallen pastry and with a gentleness that mattered, picked up the warm, grease-stained paper and glanced at Lily. He could have walked away. He didn't. The push was the mistake and the pivot. It was small and enormous at once. It was public. It was the kind of thing his assistants trained him for on crisis management drills. Deny, distance, do not kneel. But none of those rehearsed lines fit what sat in front of him. A small girl with a braid loose from her hairband, a boy with calloused hands and clean fingernails despite the grime, and a paper sack that smelled like the only thing anyone there could agree tasted of home. If this were a headline, it would be obvious. Executive shoves homeless man asking to dance with paralyzed daughter. But life is not a headline. It is the long, complicated between. The way his thumb felt sticky from the pastry filling. The way Lily's fingers curled around nothing when she wanted to hold someone. The way the boy's eyes held a quiet dignity that would not be spoken away. If this mattered to you, if a simple human moment like that lands with you the way it landed with me, consider subscribing for more stories like this. They are small and necessary. Michael's name, before he had to answer for it, had been a brand. He had learned the language of quarterly gains before he learned how to apologize. He moved through meetings with the cool assurance of a man who had hired people to feel the things he could not. He told his daughter's stories in the back seat about winning contracts, about the way great decisions felt like sails catching wind. She learned to translate momentum into shapes of people she could hold in her head. Michael understood profit as numbers and as the distance between his father's hands and hers. Lily was 15, 2 years younger than the age when Michael thought he had become too old to play. She had a small mouth and a stubborn set to her jaw, like he had when he was forced to take his first rounds of no. She loved the sound of percussion, the lonely rattle of a spoon against a glass. She loved the word again. Say it once and she would light up as if a circuit had been completed. Her world had narrowed to a routine of therapy, doctor visits, and a handful of television shows she memorized plot lines from like prayer. The paralysis had taken her legs in an afternoon that the family never put into words, a phrase that hovered over dinners, a wound that reappeared when he least expected it. They had tried everything that made sense: specialist appointments, hospital protocols, a careful diet, technologies that hummed at night like wounded satellites. Michael had learned the names of muscles and plates and the exact tone of his daughter's favorite motivational podcasts, and he had become very good at avoiding the only thing that threatened to collapse him: time with Lily that felt messy, unpredictable, and raw. That is why the boy's question had struck an exposed place inside him. That is why he had reacted. Not because the boy was dangerous, but because the boy illuminated a part of himself he did not like to see. Eli, that was what the boy was called by the small crowd who knew him near the pergola by the train tracks, had a scraggly sway to his step and a pair of old Converse that had seen better seasons. He kept clean fingernails, which felt like a choice rather than a habit. He carried a small notebook with folded pages where he kept a list of street names and bus schedules, and, on a few folded pages, poems he'd never meant to show anyone. He was 22, maybe 23.
You could sense it in the way his jaw tilted when he lied about being older to obtain work he couldn't keep, in the hopeful culprit of a grin that suggested both faith and calculation. He had been near the pond that afternoon, juggling a small paper sack left from lunch by a generous catering volunteer. He had already eaten half and was saving the rest for a person he had been trying to get to smile, a woman who moved slowly with purpose and lived partly in songs. Eli's day had been made of small trades: a song for a smile, a hand to balance a cart for a cigarette lighter, a sandwich swap for a shampoo. He had learned that dignity was stitched out of how you moved in public, less because of pride and more because of the unwillingness to be someone else's sob story. When Lily saw Eli in the folding chairs by the catering line, something like a quiet courage rooted in him. He had watched her through the fountain's mist on prior days, watched the way her eyes cataloged everything, the way she sometimes hummed to herself when the breeze smelled like frying oil. He had no right to approach. He also had a hunger that was not only for food. "May I dance with your daughter?" he had asked then, clumsy with hope. The question was pure and dangerous. It asked to cross a line that separated charity from companionship. It asked the world to be less rigid for a breath. Michael's shove sent the pastry spinning. The boy fell back with the gracelessness of someone who had practiced yielding. The smell of oil, cumin, maybe paprika, a hint of stale sugar, rose as if from the hot center of a machine. An older woman nearby, who sold knitted bookmarks at the weekend market, covered her mouth. A delivery driver cursed under his breath. Someone clicked a photo, quick and accusing. Lily watched. She always watched. She watched with the fierceness of someone forced to sit still while the world moved. Up close, the wheelchair was an island of bright stickers and a travel pillow embroidered with a little whale. She had insisted on the whale because whales were big, and also because she liked the way whales moved through still things and kept moving. Today, her right hand clutched a paper-wrapped pastry in a way that said holding was hope. The boy steadied himself and reached toward Lily as if to take her hand in a dance. He had an old radio in his backpack that sometimes played static and sometimes played old Motown. He never had much rhythm, but what he had, he offered with that rarity that trusted he had something to give. If Michael had a fault that evening, aside from his reflexes, it was his fear of ugliness. Not literal ugliness, not at all. He had no problem with sweat or mud. He feared stories that dragged his carefully tailored dignity into the dirt. The boy's approach felt like an unscheduled vulnerability, and vulnerability is contagious.
Perhaps that was the root of his shove, an effort to quarantine the moment, to keep his life free of accidental truths. After the shove, the crowd pressed inward with the hunger of people wanting someone to be right.
Versions of him began to argue inside his head. The executive, the father who remembered being clapped on the back for being unflinching. The man who ran the company whispered, "This is a liability. Move, remove." "What do you think you're doing?" Lily said, voice small but clear, the kind of question that made accusations unnecessary because it uncloaked the wrongness all the same. Michael's first instinct was to explain, to smooth, to do what professionals do, produce a statement. His second instinct, a quieter, more ancestral one, was to reach out to his daughter and pull her close in case the world around them cracked. He pulled her soft against him with the practiced grip of a man who held too many things and wanted to hold nothing less than perfectly. But his arms hesitated because his mind held a million small courtesies. He had learned to swallow things, to file them away under "not now." Eli did not shame him. He picked up the pastry with a careful hand, dusted off the gravel as best he could, and offered it to Lily, as if there had been no tripping moment at all. "I don't have much," he said softly, "but I can dance slow." Lily's eyes, which usually catalogued the world like a map, softened. There was a hunger in her gaze that looked like a small, patient fire. He shifted so slightly in her chair that Michael noticed it like a radar ping. He had seen such moves in his daughter's physiotherapy videos, a twitch that meant the body remembered something it still lived within, the memory of movement. He tightened his grip reflexively, not to stop her, he told himself, but to keep her safe from the chaos she had not asked for. Around them, no one offered the obvious. No one said softly, "Let her try." They were a public, and publics are often polite because politeness is a way to mask discomfort. The timing, the setting, the optics, all seemed to point toward removing the problem, rather than letting it complicate feelings. That was the safe, consensus way. Then Lily said, "Please," the single syllable of someone who had learned that politeness helped open doors that blunt force could not. She stretched a hand toward Eli, palm up, not demanding but inviting. The gesture was thin and brave. The world inclined. Michael had 1,000 reasons to say no. He had reputation, he had precedent, he had fear. And yet, seeing his daughter's palm reach out, so alone and burning with a wish that had nothing to do with image or return on investment, something in him constricted. Before he could articulate any policy, a man with a glossy tie, Jason, a vice president who thrived on the scent of controversy and found security in lists and control, stepped forward.
Jason's voice had the casual, perfunctory acid of someone who kept the world manageable by being loudly sensible. "Sir, we can't have this," Jason said in a sharp whisper, eyes flicking between Michael and the small group forming like flies. "You don't understand the risk," he added, mild panic pressing the edges of his civility. "We're the company that sponsors the therapy center. We can't have our patron's daughter be subject to unpredictability." Claire from HR, who wore sensible shoes and held paperwork like a talisman, put a hand up as if to check her pulse. "Protocol suggests we keep a dedicated volunteer present for interactions like this," she said, as if they were discussing office supplies. Michael felt the tautness of their voices as a rope pulling him back into a familiar shape. He took a breath, the kind that professionals take to steady public collapses. He gestured awkwardly for Eli to step back, as if that would erase the moment. He pushed the boy again, a little harder this time, and the push was public and raw. In the months after, those who were there would retell the shove in different cadences. Some would report fear, others embarrassment. A few would call it cruelty with a capital C. But in the moment, it was simply a man's need to preserve a boundary he had no right to impose. Eli steadied himself, chin up, a scar in the smile that perhaps never would be seamless. Lily's face crumpled in a way that made Michael feel as if a window had been smashed inside him. She had not cried. She had the sort of expression that was a held-back storm. Her small hand rested on the paper-wrapped pastry he still held, as if to anchor both of them to what tasted of home. Afterward, as people milled and plausible deniability did its work, Michael ushered Lily toward the car. He held her close and said the things men like him say, soft counsel, soft excuses. He found himself explaining nothing and everything. "It's not safe," he said, because that was the simplest truth and the least vulnerable lie. They drove away with the window cracked just enough for the smell of frying oil to escape, but not enough for the night air to cool anything. Michael told himself, as many times as he had to that week, that he acted in his daughter's best interest. He told himself that he knew what risk looked like and that he had to guard against it. Yet the memory of the boy's eyes kept up like a small, ungrateful echo, following him through stoplights and into the quiet corners of his hospital visits. That night, he went into Lily's room and watched her sleep with the kind of scrutiny a man gives a painting he's bought and cannot fully appreciate. He fingered the edge of her whale pillow and felt the sting of the pastry grease formulaically cleansing into his memory. In the days that followed, a small and stubborn rumor began to gather a life of its own.
In the company's internal Slack channel, a blurred photo surfaced, a paper sack on pavement, a hand frozen in the motion of reach. The comments were a mixture of schadenfreude and rush to righteousness. Some called for PR spin, others for charitable donation to the center. Some sent private messages with the clinical distance of people who care without being involved. Jason, the vice president, summoned Michael to his office with the gentle brutality of a man who could not abide mess. "We have to think of the optics," Jason said, tapping a tablet where the photo gleamed like an accusation. He gestured with a practiced nod towards probabilities and risk matrices. "There are donors who will be edgy about this. Your personal life spills into the company narrative, Michael." At moments like that, Michael felt the old man who taught him to be invisible lift his head. "We can issue a statement," Jason suggested, "a brief apology and a note about support for local shelters. We control the message. We move." But the message didn't land on Michael the way a usual self-preservation tactic did. He left the meeting with a business-as-usual veneer and found that something fundamental had altered. The shove had been a line drawn in a surprisingly tender spot. It had exposed not only his fear of being seen, but the amount of distance between who he was and who his daughter needed him to be. He began to see other things, too, small, urgent details that theretofore had been just part of background noise. On his way to work, he noticed the way the city slept in pockets, the way women with grocery bags shifted their weight to guard corners. He noticed, uncomfortably, how many steps it took to walk from the polished marble of his building to the place where people rested in doorways. He noticed the smell of frying oil as if it were the scent of something sacred and ordinary at once, the scent of the pastry that had tied all of them together in the parking lot. Eli did not disappear after the shove. He kept his distance for dignity's sake, but he watched. He watched Lily the way one watches someone learning to float, with hope that feels like abrasion. Some days he left pastries by the fountain for the regulars. Other days he traded a song for a small kindness. He observed without demanding. He kept the notebook tucked into his jacket like a secret to which no one was entitled. Michael replayed Bishov like footage on a loop. He tried to rationalize that the boy had been unpredictable, that it had been the reasonable thing to do, but each explanation felt thin. There was a small human ledger balancing in him, what he had given to business, what had been withdrawn from family, and what could be reclaimed before it was gone. The ledger had consequences he hadn't learned to accept. At the company the next week, the board asked for damage control. The lawyers suggested a short statement and a charity gift. Jason leaned into the plan with the certainty of someone who managed risk for a living. We need to show that we support the center, that we have protocols in place for these kinds of interactions. No further comment, he advised. Claire in HR, who often played translator between the company's ideals and its messy implementation, added a voice of caution that surprised Michael. She said, softly, "You know that a statement won't fix what happened. People need to see action, not PR. If you insist on making this right for optics, it will read flat. But if you actually mean it—" Her words landed like a stone at the edge of a pond. The ripple that followed was quieter than panic. It was a question of some depth. What did it mean to actually mean something? At work, projects slid into their usual grooves, but Michael's presence felt different. He attended meetings and found them full of the gentle hum of people who thought they were the important center. He listened more than he spoke. He watched others make proposals about empathy as if it were a KPI. People use the word compassion like a flavor garnish. And yet, the image of Eli holding out that pastry toward Lily remained vivid. Michael found he could not imagine that boy living as some abstraction. Abstract people do not have names that fit in sentences. They do not have the soft thrum of a harmonica when the sun angling over the fountain hits the metal in the way that makes Eli's shoulders soften. They do not have a list of bus routes tucked into a notebook with sentences written in a small looping hand. He started, quite clumsily, to notice details: the chalked numbers near a curb where people slept, the way the city discarded sandwich crusts in precisely the same bins as it discarded paperwork, the way generosity often presented itself without applause. The paper-wrapped pastry became a small object in the film of his days, something he couldn't quite shake. It lodged in his mind like a pebble in a shoe, a minor irritation that insisted on being felt. On Saturday, he met Claire for coffee by a bench near the therapy center where the company had donated funds. She arrived with a folder that contained policies, programs, and a list of potential local partners. Her approach was methodical, a roadmap towards sustainable support. Hire through our social hiring program, she suggested. Offer a paid internship for someone like Eli. Partner with the shelter for long-term housing subsidies. Be consistent. He listened. In the theater of his life, he'd always preferred to write the big checks and walk away. He had noticed recently that checks could not buy back a wrong glance or a shove. "We can do that," he said, at first in the measured tones of the executive who feared commitment. But there was something else behind his words, a softer echo of curiosity. "We can try to do that well." Claire's face softened. "It's messy," she said. "You're going to have to be present."
You'll have pushback. You will also have a chance to make something better, not to buy your way out of being seen. Michael left the meeting with a plan on paper and a heart that felt suspiciously tender. Plans can be comforting, boxes ticked, charts created, dates circled. But plans are not the same as people. He was learning that, slowly, like someone learning a new language. If the shove had been an ember, then the days that followed were the slow tending it needed to either combust or cool. Michael began to visit the therapy center more often, in the clumsy rhythms of someone who had never practiced humility. He started by making calls, asking about programs that supported integration and job readiness. He volunteered, in a manner of speaking, to sit in on community meetings and to sign the forms that would allow the company to sponsor a paid internship. But money and forms are scaffolding. People need more than scaffolding. They need persistent presence, the kind that does not allow you to retreat into sanitized philanthropy. Claire reminded him of that in the way that a good teacher does, gently but relentlessly. If you're serious, she said, you will need to show up without an agenda.
practice showing up. Across town, Eli noticed the company banner near the therapy center and suspected, but did not expect, that the man in the banner had anything to do with the man who shoved him. He watched the doors of the center through the fountain's glass and thought small, practical thoughts. Maybe there would be a program that would let him work in a kitchen or learn an apprentice trade. Maybe he could keep his notebook dry. He kept his dignity intact by refusing to ask for pity, and that refusal became both armor and isolation. At home, Lily had a new preoccupation with the idea of dancing. It had been a simple curiosity at first, a melody that lived on a streaming playlist she replayed like a prayer. She would ask Michael about the way people moved, about the names of dances he had only ever seen in movies. The more she asked, the more she revealed a desire that felt like a small, consuming thing. She wanted to be part of a world that did not exclude her. He taught her in the clumsy way people teach who have forgotten how to be asked to be gentle. He played music for her in the living room, where the whale pillow sat like a small island. He watched the way her toes, the mechanical image of them in his memory, twitched at a song's swell, as if remembering how to want. There were people in his life who resisted the idea that a shove could mean more than a moment. They considered it an anomaly. They urged brighter lights on the blot, a neat press release. Jason kept saying, "You handle this now. The company's reputation matters." But Claire kept asking him to consider whether reputation could be remade by being smaller, truer, more inconveniently present. She did not suggest spectacle. She suggested pattern.
She suggested integrity disguised as routine. In the weeks that followed, Michael did what he had not done in years. He prioritized unscheduled time. He began with small things, an extra hour in the mornings to sit with Lily while she drank her tea, a Sunday afternoon to sit across from Eli at the therapy center's outreach table and listen without offering solutions. He found that listening was harder than he had imagined. Listening required that he not be the center. Each time he succeeded in making it about someone else, a small part of his old armor dented. The city, that patient, indifferent organism, continued to move. Buses hissed air, streetlights blinked on. Eli continued to bring his notebook to the fountain and added to it a list of places that gave work, an idea for collecting bottles and trading them in, a sketch of a little cart he might one day push. He penciled in a faint hope that did not need to be named. One rainy afternoon, Michael found himself at the therapy center not because of a press release or an external obligation, but because his daughter had insisted. "Dad," she had said with a gravity that forced him to follow, "I want to go somewhere where people can teach me how to move." He could have said no. Instead, he felt the stubbornness of a man learning to be tender. He felt the paper sack pastry itch in his memory, and he knew with the modest, unclassy clarity that his child's small wish might be more important than his fear of being vulnerable in public. He pushed the door open and stepped into a place filled with the scent of lemon cleaner and the static energy of people trying to put themselves back together. There were programs there, messy and human, therapists who had more patience than the world deserved, volunteers who came on Saturdays with music and warm pastries, and sitting on a bench near the fountain as if the place itself was a magnet, Eli watched the doors and scribbled small lists. He noticed Michael without needing to be noticed. He had learned the art of being present without imposing. When their eyes met, there was an understanding that neither had words for. Michael was a man who had pushed too quickly and had begun to untangle himself from the reflex. Eli was a boy who had been pushed and had kept his dignity like a talisman. Lily was a girl whose heart had been invited into motion and whose body had learned to be patient. They did not speak immediately. That would be the wrong thing. Instead, they circled the edges of each other like planets, cautious and gravitational. The city made its noises. A train far off sighed like an animal. The The pastry smell lingered, sometimes like a memory, sometimes like an accusation. What none of them could know in those first clumsy days was whether such small, ordinary collisions could stitch a change that would last.
What neither of them realized was that a single act, a hand extended, a pastry offered, a boy asked to dance, can become a hinge on which a life turns. Yet that is how it begins, not with grand proclamations, but with the quiet and awkward decisions to notice, to stay, to be corrected. The shove was recorded in the memory of the company and in the private ledger of a father. The consequences were still in their early mapping. There were plans on paper and a faint willingness in a man who had to learn humility. There were practical lists, internships to be created, partnership proposals to be drawn up, Claire's careful notes about sustainable engagement. There was a boy who carried dignity in a battered notebook, and a girl who kept asking for music. And there was a paper-wrapped pastry in the back of Michael's mind, warm, greasy, and oddly holy. The scene was still unraveling, not yet at its climax, not yet at the moment where something entirely unexpected might upend everyone's assumptions. But the threads were taut. The city hummed with possibility and unease. People were starting to choose. Some would choose publicity. Some would choose acts true as small coins. Some would choose silence. One evening, as rain came down in a steady, patient sheet and the lights of the city smeared like watercolor, Michael sat in his car with Lily sleeping beside him in a wheelchair adapted to the seat. He looked at her small, trusting face and at the whale pillow and felt an unfamiliar hunger to make things right that was not about image, but about the slow, ordinary duty of being a father. He opened his wallet and found, tucked between credit cards, a crumb of grease on a napkin and the faint imprint of the pastry's oily kiss. He thought of Eli, of Claire's quiet insistence on living out compassion, of Jason's polished panic. He thought for the first time in a long time about the pattern of his days and whether he wanted it to be his epitaph. He felt, in a corner of himself he had not visited since he was small and ignorant, a readiness to be humbled. The next steps would be awkward, costly in more ways than money. They would require more than Sunday statements. They would demand a rearrangement of time and a willingness to be seen doing it. They would ask him to accept being wrong in front of others, to let the world witness his small, flumbling repairs. He did not know then how the story would bend. He did not know whether a community could truly change, or whether a girl's wish to dance would be fulfilled in any notable way. But there was a crack now through which something else might get in. Curiosity, shame transformed into resolve, the possibility that a hand extended in real life can multiply into many others. They were at the cusp of choosing. The night held its breath. The night broke into ordinary light, and the city resumed its indifferent schedule.
But for Michael Grayson, the pause that had lived between heartbeats the night of the shove did not dissipate. It arranged itself into a slow, patient work. The first act of that work was small and private. He walked into Claire's office before the sun burned the glass of the skyline. He carried a travel mug that had gone cold, and the corner of a paper napkin folded into his wallet, the faint grease mark visible when he unfolded it under the fluorescent office light. Claire did not look surprised. She had the steady look of someone used to being the adult in rooms where adults resisted adulthood. "I don't want this to be PR," Michael said, not in the clipped tones of the executive, but in the rawer register of someone trying to say what mattered. "I want to do it right." She took the napkin from his fingers with a careful curiosity, as if examining not a relic, but a question. "Then show up to the hard part," she said. "Commit to more than checks. Commit to time, to structure, to being inconveniently present. Michael left that morning with a list Claire had written in a firm, neat hand, an outline for a paid internship program paired with housing vouchers, partnerships with a local shelter that taught job skills, and a monthly volunteer hour requirement for executives with a public-facing role that included listening sessions. It reads like policy, but Claire had insisted the true work could not be staged into bullet points alone. It's about pattern, she reminded him, not spectacle. By the time Lily urged him to visit the center for a class, not for marketing, not for headlines, but because she wanted to do a dance class that ran on Saturday afternoons, Michael found himself turning left off the polished avenue and stepping into a neighborhood that smelled like lemon cleaner and grilled coffee and the indifferent sweetness of someone else's midday bread. He sat on a folding chair in the corner and watched a room where people practiced taking small movements back. He watched a place where lockers hummed with nothing dramatic, where a volunteer tied shoelaces with the kind of tenderness experts call skill. Eli was there, as he had been in the days after the shove, sitting at the far bench, not encroaching, but keeping a watchful space near the radio he'd coaxed into crackly life. He had washed his hair and tied it back, and his notebook rested on his knees like a map. When Michael approached, there was a moment where Eli looked as if he could either stand or step away. He stayed put. He did not run. For someone whose life had encouraged avoidance as a survival skill, this was a kind of courage. The program Claire arranged offered Eli a paid apprenticeship in the company's outreach kitchens, a small team that catered events and used food as a dignified entry point for training. It was a modest pay and a modest station, cleanup, prep, inventory. It required punctuality and offered dignity in return.
There were skeptics who muttered about risk. Jason counted the cost and reputation and gave a tight, resigned smile. Michael expected the board to fuss and Jason to demand a press release, but he also expected, with a slowly growing clarity, to be responsible for the messy human parts of that initiative. The first weeks were awkward in ways that money cannot soften. Eli arrived with a backpack and a wary politeness. He handled knives clumsily, and yet, after 2 dinners of practice, he learned the rhythm of the kitchen. He folded napkins with a kind of economy that came from necessity and never flinched from the smell of frying oil. He hummed quietly while he worked. Sometimes he would scribble in his notebook and then glance up with a question that always had the dignity of a person learning how to be seen. Lily insisted on attending the Saturday classes. She wanted to be part of more than a spectator role in her own life. The first time she tried a transfer from her wheelchair onto a low bench, a therapist named Rosa, small, efficient, and full of sunburnt patience, guided her with hands that knew the careful choreography of muscles that have been taught to forget how to move. Rosa did not promise miracles. She promised repetition and the honest work of practice. At first, the progress was fractions and decimals, a degree more lean to the right, a second of balance held, a twitch that woke memory. Lily loved the music they used, a mix of old soul and cautious pop that made her eyes sparkle like a lighthouse. She clapped when she landed a shift in weight without falling back into the pool of defensiveness that had come to characterize so much of her days. Michael, doing what Claire called learning to be present, showed up not with speeches, but with presence. He sat in the back of the room, close enough to pass a water bottle if needed, farther back than the other fathers who leaned forward with instant agendas. He brought nothing but his name and a willingness to make himself accountable. He read the email thread Claire sent him and tried, clumsily at first, to use the language of steady accompaniment rather than the language of rescue. Workplace dynamics, however, are never purely private. Jason watched the project like a man watching a slow leak under a polished floor. At a board meeting, he laid out liabilities, potential negative exposure, donors who might question postures of mercy, and a list of stakeholders who expected sanitized optics.
He spoke with the certainty of someone whose job it was to reduce complexity into spreadsheets. Michael listened and then pushed back in a manner that surprised him. He did not argue with spreadsheets, but with the simple fact that human beings were not items to be mitigated. He told the board he would take on the politically risky side of visibility. If hurt feelings came at the cost of being honest, he would pay for that honesty with his own reputation.
Don't make it performative, Claire had told him. If you do this for optics, it will read as theater. So Michael asked for no ribbon cutting and no staged photo ops. He asked only that the company not pretend the problem could be solved with a line item. He promised more than the moment. He promised a year of funding for the internship, housing support vetted by the shelter partners, and a vocational trainer hired to incorporate life skills with culinary instruction. Jason called it interface management. Claire called it basic decency. Michael called it necessary. He trusted, perhaps foolishly at first, that the company could bear the inconvenience of being a little less pristine. In the kitchen, Eli learned faster than anyone expected. He took to slicing vegetables with a focus that suggested he'd cultivated patience the hard way. He found joy in small tasks, the exact angle that made a tray sit steady, how to fold a napkin so it held a scent without trapping it. Lily, when she could, came to the kitchen and watched him work. Sometimes she would hum along to the radio he kept near the sink. Sometimes she would ask him to show him a knife trick using the blunt side of a spatula. The relationship that formed between them was not cinematic at first. It was a rhythm of glances, shared jokes about radio static, and a few moments of quiet that had the tenderness of a shared secret. They were both learning new economies of brace, how much to ask, how much to give, how to keep dignity intact while depending on others sometimes. When they practiced dancing, Eli was careful. He never overstepped. He would stand behind Lily's wheelchair, and together they would sway. He told her about the days of standing in subways to read poems aloud for coins, and how a kind woman once gave him a sandwich without pitying him. Lily's favorite part of rehearsal was when the radio played a version of Marvin Gaye. She would close her eyes and feel the rhythm, as if somewhere in her limbs a memory of motion lived like a buried city, waiting for the tide to reveal it. An assistant from PR leaked nothing, Claire had insisted, but the smell of change rustled like a rumor through the company. Small, ordinary things shifted, a volunteer day added to the calendar, a request for more honest payroll allocations for the internship, a new line item that read housing partner. Employees began to ask questions at water coolers, and a few started to show up at the center on their own, not because the boss had asked, but because something in them had been touched. Not everyone approved. There were whispers. He's just covering himself. This is an optics play. Jason muttered that charity was not the business of shareholders. Some donors grumbled in private cafes. But at the therapy center, the work, on a human level, continued.
The training that was offered to interns like Eli included not only culinary skills, but also resume building, basic financial literacy, and the sometimes harder lesson of how to receive without being shamed. Months of that work passed, and the small, incremental wins began to compound. Eli was reliable. He was not perfect. He had days when old fears made him late, times when the street still pulled at him like a tide. But he returned, and he worked harder to be someone who could be trusted. The center provided a case manager who helped him apply for an apartment voucher. The company signed a 3-year commitment with the shelter, moving beyond a one-time donation to a structural partnership. Lily's therapy progressed the way all honest recoveries do, through repetition, through days that felt like backsliding, through stubborn small victories. Rosa taught her to shift weight with a sequence of exercises that sounded deceptively like a poem. The therapist timed it with music sometimes, and Lily responded as if the music woke small, lined memories in her muscles.
Michael, watching from the cheap folding chair in the corner of the gym, learned what it meant to be both impatient and present. He cried quietly after a session, not out of triumph, but out of the recognition that he had kept a distance he did not fully understand. He found himself apologizing to Lily, not with slick speeches, but with the small language of changed schedules. He deliberately left meetings earlier or canceled them because he wanted to be the person who showed he belonged in the slow, unglamorous parts of his daughter's life. The climb was not without tension. Jason continued to press for tighter boundaries. At one board meeting, during a quarter that was not particularly generous with profits, he argued that continued investment in such programs posed a risk to the company's bottom line. "You are asking shareholders to accept a long-term, costly commitment," Jason said, with the smooth confidence of someone who measures everything against a ledger. "We are not a charity." "You are right," Rosa replied, and her answer surprised both of them. "We are not. We are a company that does business in a city that shelters some of us and discards others. If we want to call ourselves civic partners, we need to act like it." The board voted to continue funding the program. Not everyone was thrilled, but enough were moved by Claire's plan and some quiet public support from junior employees who cared enough to sign a petition. The infrastructure of small generosity began, haltingly, to look like policy. And then came the day the city pressed a hand of copper sunlight against the therapy center's windows, and a small celebration was scheduled. A community recital to mark 6 months of the program. No press, no cameras, no staged shots, just families, volunteers, staff, interns, and the people they were there to serve. They decorated folding tables with crepe paper and a few flowers that looked brave in plastic vases. A volunteer baker provided pastries. The faint smell of frying oil threaded through the air like a memory not yet resolved. Lily wanted to dance at the recital. For months she had watched others move and had practiced the tiny transfers and the shifting balances. She had gained strength in her core and had grown in the strange mathematics of trust. Michael noticed the way she would hum a particular song under her breath now, one she never tired of. She had a favorite sweater, a thrift find with a whale stitched near the hem, that she insisted on wearing, even though Michael suggested something more formal. Eli signed up to accompany her. He said very little when he asked. His voice was even and low, and bore the sort of humility that is not shame. He had been practicing the slow dance, not a ballroom twirl, but a careful rhythm of step, support, and steady hands. The staff agreed, and Rosa and a pair of therapists planned for the structure they could provide: harnesses, assistance from behind, planned movements that allowed for dignity without manufacture. The room filled. Volunteers took their places. The radio that had lived in Eli's backpack a dozen times now stood on a table, its dial set to a station that sometimes played the exact right song. It hummed with static like an old friend. When the first chords of a familiar track swelled, the room settled into a hush. Lily's parents, a cluster of neighbors, some board members and staff leaned forward as if to hear a story that had been held back. Michael felt a frost of panic for reasons he could not entirely name. It was not the fear of being seen, it was the fear of hope itself. He had been careful for months in his exposure to small miracles, refusing the narrative that a life could be fixed in a single moment. The therapy team had given permission for the movement they were about to try. The center's case manager had cleared the logistics, and Eli had rehearsed with Lily in private, each rehearsal a small promise. They started slow. Rosa stood behind Lily, hands ready. Eli stood to her side, his palm open. The music pulsed like a pulse of wings. Lily, who had practiced so many times that her fingers remembered the sequence, leaned forward slightly. She is not small in courage, and the room felt the shape of it like a physical thing. Then, to the astonishment of everyone in that modest room, Lily shifted her weight just a fraction more than before. Muscle and memory and months of repetition converged into a precarious equilibrium. She planted one foot, and then, as witnesses later described it, she stood, not in the language of miracles, but in the language of accumulated practice that breaks a long silence. Rosa had her hands ready. Eli steadied her with a hand at the lower back and another at the elbow. For those seconds, the room held its breath.
How to explain what happened in that thin sliver of time? Doctors later called it a remarkable convergence of physical therapy, neuromuscular memory, and emotional surge. Therapists described it as a breakthrough made possible by the scaffolding of months of disciplined work. Witnesses spoke of the electricity of the moment, how Eli's presence, the music, and Lily's own relentless will came together in a way that made her rise. No one claimed an easy answer. No one declared a formula. It was, by any honest measuring, a human event that felt larger than the sum of its parts. Michael felt sound enter him as if for the first time. He had always prided himself on being able to control outcomes. Control evaporated like fog in heat. When Lily's feet met the floor and she lifted, his body answered the truth he had been avoiding. He wept openly, an adult unpracticed at this softness. He stepped toward them and sat on a folding chair, unsure whether to speak or simply to make space. Lily laughed, a bright, surprised sound she had not used in public in years. It was not a roar nor a proclamation. It was a small, luminous expression. She did not stand for a long time. Rosa and Eli guided her back into her wheelchair with care. The standing lasted a breath and a lesson. But for a moment she had been upright, supported by the patient scaffolding of people who had believed in repetitive, quiet work. What followed was not a flurry of conversions or instant declarations. There were hugs and tears and the soft business of helping Lily into a chair. Therapists reminded everyone that gains can be fragile and require continued effort. But the air had shifted. People who had merely tolerated the initiative now spoke differently about it in the corridor. Jason's voice, when he came forward with an awkward smile, was still cautious. He said nothing grand. He murmured that he had brought extra chairs. Small gestures have their own language. Eli felt something too, if not the same. He sat on the edge of the table, holding his notebook like a talisman, watching the way the room hummed with a new possibility. He had offered the dance not to be applauded, but because he had recognized in Lily a shared hunger for presence. He had been given a role in something that had changed him, work with honest pay, a place where he could keep his notebook dry, the sense that he had not been shoved away from the world entirely. In the weeks and months after the recital, the company's program settled into a pattern that suggested endurance rather than flash. They hired a caseworker full-time. They funded an apartment for Eli through a vetted program and helped him move in with a stipend for initial costs. The company employed 2 other formerly homeless people under a bridging program that offered both training and supervised employment at community events. Claire scheduled monthly debriefs with staff and with the interns. She invited skeptics to come and watch a day in the life rather than merely take headlines as truth. There were setbacks. A donor withdrew quietly, citing discomfort. A small scandal of miscommunication with a vendor threatened to derail a catering launch. Eli had nights where the streets called and he needed support. Lily had sessions when her muscles would misbehave and she would cry with frustration. Michael faced criticism from other executives who thought his priorities had drifted. They whispered about distraction and the risk to shareholder value. Jason continued to mark the balance sheets with a practical spine. But there was also a new language in the halls. Colleagues began to swap weekend volunteer shifts. An intern in marketing organized a fundraiser that paired artists with the therapy center. A group of employees pooled small amounts to underwrite extracurricular classes. The company's HR manual added a page about social hiring, not as a virtue signal, but as policy. Claire wrote an internal note titled Sustained Presence, and it became less of a memo and more of a culture. Michael made amends in ways that were accurately human. He did not try to erase the shove with grand pronouncements. He met Eli in plain places, over coffee in a community room with the sugar of pastry crumbs, at the shelter's donation center sorting blankets, in the kitchen training room wiping down counters. He asked Eli about his poems in his notebook and listened when Eli read a line aloud about trains that smelled like rain. Michael's apologies were good enough and sometimes messy. They were a slow offering of time, of being scheduled into the ordinary days that form a life. Lily and Eli grew into a friendship that looked neither performative nor overly sentimental. They met for music sessions, for practice, for quiet walks, with spots of progress noted like small stones placed along a path. Eli taught Lily how to time a rhythm with a spoon tapping against the side of a cup. Lily taught Eli how to notice the curve of a word in her book of poems. They collected small rituals, a preferred brand of pastry in a paper sack folded the same way every time, shared playlists, and a little radio that never quite got the right station but always got the feeling. Michael kept the napkin. He pressed it between the pages of a ledger he used for budgets that now included the line items he had never thought would be his responsibility. The grease mark, faded but stubborn, lived as a constant reminder. It was not fetishized, it was not displayed like a trophy. It was folded and tucked where he would find it on days he felt tempted to return to distance. The city listened and shifted. A couple of local restaurants began to partner with the shelter to sponsor paid shifts. A city council member noticed the program and invited Claire for a consultation on scaling similar initiatives.
The company's CSR team published a report not as a boast, but as a reflection. We learned to be present before we learned to be proud. That line, humble and unadorned, traveled in the right circles. People read it and thought of the messy commerce of dignity. Time continued its slow authoring. Lily stood more over the months, sometimes with hesitation, sometimes for moments that felt like steps. The progress was never guaranteed, never linear. It was a sequence of breaths, of therapies, of nights when muscles remembered how to listen to commands they'd been taught to ignore. The standing at the recital remained a hinge, not a miraculous cure offered as creed, but a moment that opened a space where sustained work could happen. Michael's change was not immediate religiosity. He did not become faultless. He forgot things, lost patience sometimes, and misstepped in the politics of the company. But he learned to accept correction without deflection. He learned to admit that something he had considered a liability, being visible in messiness, could be an asset to a life worth leading. Eli's life shifted in the practical ways that dignity accrues: a regular paycheck, a small apartment with a window that let in sunlight at breakfast, a place to keep the notebook dry, and the sense that a company's commitment was not a one-off. He kept working with the kitchen team and eventually proposed a small catering idea that used unsold bakery items to create meals for the shelter's outreach program, a practical innovation that cut waste and fed people. Jason, who had been skeptical to the end, found himself one morning in the kitchen early, stuck with a broken conference room lock and no access card until someone could help. Eli opened the door to let him in. Jason looked at him in a way that suggested he had been seeing things through the wrong lens. The two men did not become friends, but there was a new mutual respect that did not need theatrical expression. At home, the whale pillow sat on a shelf with a neat indentation from the many nights it had supported Lily's head. Michael had begun to keep a box on his kitchen counter, where he put the paper-wrapped scraps of pastry he had once thought disposable. He kept one small paper sack folded and framed in a shallow box with the coffee ticket of the day of the recital. It was a humble reliquary, a crumb of a life they refused to forget. Years later, the ripple that started in that parking lot took forms that surprised the people who thought themselves architects of it. The program extended into an apprenticeship network with other companies. A council committee took Claire's policy recommendations as a model for a pilot city program. The therapy center expanded an outreach kitchen. People who had once passed by the city's vulnerable found themselves stopping to hand over a pastry or to buy a bus ticket.
Little economies of dignity grew up around the simplest acts: a shared sandwich, a volunteered hour, the slow art of showing up. But the true measure of change for Michael remained private and domestic. On quiet evenings, he would sit with Lily and watch her television, and they would talk about music and the sound of rain. He learned not to interrupt her sentences with the language of industry. He let himself enter the small rituals that had once made him anxious. He learned how to be bored in a good way, the way a person is quiet because there is nothing urgent to fix. And sometimes, when the apartment was soft with the yellow of late afternoon, he would take out the folded napkin and smooth it. It had become more than grease and memory. It had become a promise written invisibly on paper. Never again to be the man whose reflex is to push away what he does not wish to see. The napkin was not atonement, nothing so tidy. It was a reminder that the work of repair does not end with a single upright moment, that it requires sustained attention and endless reoffering of presence. The boy who had once been a nameless commotion in a parking lot had a life afterward. Eli married a woman from a community art program and sometimes brought her to the therapy center to teach mural making. He kept his notebook and dated it with small victories. He did not let the world make him small again. He learned that dignity grows not only in shelter, but in predictable work and in people who, after an error, choose to remain. At a company anniversary, the CEO, not Michael now, but someone who had watched the arc, spoke about the organization's commitments. He did not craft a hero out of Michael. He offered the story as a caution and a model. He read the company's new policy aloud: partnerships with shelters, social hiring quotas, a fund for housing security. When he mentioned Claire by name, applause rose in the auditorium, genuine and surprised. Michael did not attend the anniversary. He had promised to spend the day with Lily and to help her with a music therapy assignment that involved counting beats and learning to feel rhythm in a new way. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to the sounds of the city beyond the window. He felt enough to be quiet. A mural near the therapy center, painted by art students and some company volunteers, showed people in a circle connected by a ribbon that looked like a pastry steam. Underneath, someone had painted a small paper sack, and beside it the words, "Small gestures, big consequences." The mural was not perfect. It had drips and places where the paint thinned. It felt honest. Years later, a visitor to the therapy center would be shown photographs, a group from the company sorting blankets, Eli with a tray of neatly folded napkins, Lily standing, leaning into the music. They would be told how one afternoon in a parking lot had turned into a long commitment.
They would be told about the napkin that changed a man's habits. But those who lived the story understood it had never been about one man's enlightenment. It had been about a string of people choosing, day after day, to make themselves available to the labor of noticing. The shove was real, and the pain it caused was real. The standing was real, and it was made possible by repetition and care. The rest, the housing, the jobs, the policies, were the scaffolding that let the fragile human moments extend into life. On a quiet evening, Michael placed the framed paper sack on a low shelf next to a small photograph of Lily and Eli laughing over a badly tuned radio. Sometimes guests would ask about it, and he would tell the stories simply: the push, the pastry, the boy who offered to dance. He would not add moralizing. It was enough that people heard the ordinary truth. The object was not a trophy. It was a lit candle that he kept from going out. If the title of their story had to be blunt about the drama, he pushed him away. It was also true, tenderly and finally, that the one who stood was the daughter who owned a stubborn joy and a patience that did not fit neatly into any chart. She stood and made them all see that life is not only measured by the days we control, but by the days we allow the world to teach us. When people asked Michael what he had learned, he found himself less prone these days to pithy answers. He would say something clumsy and honest, that dignity is not given in one act, but returned through repeated practices, that vulnerability is contagious in the best way, that apologies mean nothing without habits. He would add, quietly, that sometimes the most important work of leadership is to be willing to be corrected. The city kept humming. The company kept balancing profits and people, often awkwardly. The therapy center kept its doors open. Eli kept his notebook. Lily kept her playlist, and sometimes she would sway in the kitchen, her hand resting on a counter as if remembering a conversation she once had with a boy who asked if he might dance. And the napkin, folded and faintly stained, held its place in Michael's life. He would sometimes take it out on nights when he felt small and remind himself of the moment that had begun a long undoing. It was a touchstone, a simple thing that tethered him to the fact that he had once been capable of pushing away what he could have embraced, and that he had, by the stubbornness of being a father and the survivability of human connection, chosen to try to be better. If you felt this story today, if it left a small thing in you that wants to be acted on, share it with someone who needs to hear that small gestures can change trajectories. Consider one small thing you can do today.